Hello and welcome to EDH Rec's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDH Rec and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. The commander we're discussing in this installment is a real tool. Henzie Toolbox Torre is one of the standout commanders from New Capenna, giving all of our creatures that cost 4 or more mana the Blitz ability, which gives them haste, sacrifices them at the end of the turn, and draws us a card to refund their loss. In addition to this, Henzie reduces those Blitz costs for each time we've cast him from the command zone this game. I know this is technically a Riveteer's commander, but looking at Henzie's EDH Rec page provokes only one response. Jundum! This is quintessential Jund beatdown, and it's pretty darn incredible. Henzie clearly slams huge creatures into play turn after turn, burying our opponents under the relentless pressure of big baddies. Let's get going! We'll snag Henzie's average deck list from the average deck feature and plug it into the Archidect deck building website. As always, any swaps made to the deck must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall price of the list. To anyone familiar with sneak attack decks, a lot of Henzie's average deck may look pretty familiar. There's a very high density of enormous creatures for us to play around with, which cover a myriad of amazing effects. Whether they're blowing up enemy permanents, drawing us more cards, getting stuff back from the graveyard, or producing tons upon tons of tokens. A detail that I enjoy a lot about this type of deck is that it never feels like any singular creature outshines the rest. These are just all haymakers in their own right, and there's no singular creature upon which the deck's entire strategy hinges. Combined with a nice suite of instant speed interaction and a tremendous number of ramp effects to play more and more and more of these huge creatures as the game progresses, Henzie's toolbox looks less like an actual toolbox and a lot more like a rocket launcher. Real quick, I'll shout out some signature aspects of Henzie's strategy. Naturally, this is beefy creatures.deck. Creatures that provide extra card advantage with their abilities are especially noteworthy. If they're blitzed, they have one turn to make a big impact, and even though blitz will draw us a card to recoup the loss of the creature, it's nice to get even more out of them, to keep our big engine fueled. Others here have clever interactions with death too. Woodfall Primus persists to come right back, for instance, and the new Ancient Brass Dragon is an instant hit with Henzie decks, bringing back our blitzed creatures every time it lands a hit. This is even a deck where Protean Hulk is a fair and fun inclusion, which is a total delight to see. Toolbox Torre indeed. I'm especially a fan of the smaller, but not actually small, creatures that help us ramp even more. This deck's mana curve is high, so these creatures that intentionally want to perish so that they can give us tons of extra resources are really darn clutch. That Seed Guide Ash is especially cool. It's not just about the creatures, though. Anyone who's played sneak attack decks knows that it's also about what we do with those creatures after combat. And these artifacts, enchantments, and spells are all tuned to help us gain tons of extra benefits from all these creatures that will happen to die anyway. Evolutionary Leap, Greater Good, and Torre take our already doomed creatures and turn them into even more fuel. Life's Legacy, Victimize, or Industrial Advancement supplement it even further as well. Like, these are already perfectly good cards to play even if we weren't blitzing creatures out, you know? This deck really knows how to use all parts of the buffalo. And there are some handsome tricks lying about too. Cauldron of Souls will help any creature we want to stick around, as will Malakir Rebirth. We don't need to blitz every creature we play either, so these are also just good protection pieces in their own right. And Chainer is pretty sneaky fun too, letting us get those creatures back for either full price or letting us blitz them again and again from the graveyard if we so choose, because Henzie doesn't specify that blitz only works from the hand. All in all, there are a lot of cool ways to bring the beat down. Alright, let's start tuning. We have two categories for swaps. First, we'll cover some basic essentials, and second, we'll help the deck improve its punchiness. No time to waste, let's hop right to it. I actually don't have that many swaps to make to this current Henzie list. I really like this deck. There's always action going on, and it's really fun to play around with big creatures going from hand to field to graveyard to back again. I think a lot of the improvements that we can make to this deck will not come in the form of raw upgraded cards, but actually will come in the form of improving our understanding of the deck's play patterns. First things first, Death Reap Ritual doesn't belong in this deck, and it probably shouldn't have appeared in this precon, because it's an unintuitive rules non-bow with Henzie that I expect will confuse a lot of players. In fact, if I recall my recording schedule correctly, you may even hear more about this in a Challenge the Stats in an upcoming podcast episode. But basically here, the advanced rules on Death Reap state that a creature has to have died before the end step for Death Reap to trigger at all. The Blitz effect makes us sacrifice a creature in the end step, so the Death Reap won't trigger off of our own blitzed creatures. If enough creatures are dying in other ways in your Henzie decks, this can theoretically still be worth it. But I personally don't like this tricky rules interaction at all, and I think this deck would get more card draw from just a regular old painful truths. I know it's simple, but 3 cards for 3 mana is just a really good rate, and it doesn't depend upon our board state to get anything done, which I think is really important because that's a type of card advantage that we don't see a lot of in this deck right now, and I like diversifying our card advantage sources. After that, here we have a Lifecrafter's Bestiary, a card that I do respect, but one that I think only partially delivers in this deck. It's not bad, I just think this deck has another version of card advantage that it might prefer a little more. Have y'all heard the word of our good lord and savior Protection Racket? This is not a card for every deck, but I do think it's a good card for this one. Every turn, we force our opponents to let us either draw extra cards or else take a bunch of damage. In a deck with a lot of tiny mana value cards, this would not be worth it. Any lands we flip off the top are easy for opponents to automatically pay 0 life and toss away, for example. But the average mana value of this deck is 4.06. Our commander, by its very definition, wants us to play a ton of cards that cost 4 mana or more, so we have a ton of painful hits off this thing. And it's also just a riotously fun card to play, flipping random stuff off the top of the deck and seeing what we get. I just love it, I can't recommend it enough, especially in a deck with this many high-cost haymakers. Before we go any further, I also want to acknowledge this land count. 34 is a low number, almost the type of land count that I would associate with like Elf Ball decks. I do think this Henzie average deck is able to get away with a lower land count because it has so much mana acceleration in the 99 already, like at least 15 sources. So we don't need to go too overboard, but I'd still feel better with at least 1 more mana, you know? Let's just clean up a little bit of this mana base. I'm going to add the common fetchers because we have a few cards in this deck that care about either landfall or lands in graveyards, just in case these synergies ever happen to come up and give us a teensy bit of extra benefit. It's a small detail, but when we have this many 6, 7, and 8 drops in a deck, I just want to make sure that our mana is as consistent as it can be, without making us float over too far. And alright, now let's just get into it. Myth Unbound. This card appears in 42% of Henzie decks right now, but I'm going to side with the 58% who aren't playing it. I think this will end up being a controversial cut, so bear with me, but I just don't think that you need to go out of your way to get this card. I think it's kinda bleh. I get it. Henzie has rewards for being cast from the command zone multiple times, but these benefits just feel negligible. This card lets us save 1 mana on our commander's second cast. We'll draw 1 card if it gets sent back to the command zone. That just doesn't seem worth it. If we played a proper ramp spell, that would give us mana to help us cast all of our spells. If we played a proper draw spell, we'd get actual card advantage, not just a conditional cantrip. Even partner decks, where Myth would be twice as effective, have historically avoided playing this card. Playing this card means that we are intending to incorporate some degree of failure as part of our game plan. To put it bluntly, if this card ends up doing a lot of work, I'd argue it's because we're already losing that game. I'd rather play something that prevents us from losing in the first place. I get it, this card technically does have synergy with Henzie. I just don't think that that synergy is better than the synergy we would get from other cards that could occupy this card slot instead. I think this card puts too much of an emphasis or priority on our commander, and I submit that the point of this deck is not to make the cheapest blitz costs possible. The point of this deck is just to play a bunch of enormous beefy creatures, and our commander is not here to be the linchpin of that strategy, but simply to add some flair to the beatdown. So anyway, yeah, I'm cutting Myth Unbound, and I'm gonna replace it with another much spicier enchantment in part 2, but for now, girl bye. Alright, we've covered the basics and things are feeling a little bit more level, but that means it is time for our next section. Let's get punchy. One of the weird pitfalls of this current average list is that I think it's trying to be a little bit too clever for its own good. We really don't need to worry about a ton of fancy nonsense here. There's only one strategy that needs to reign supreme: Jund 'em out. To start, let's talk about the Sabertooth. I get the sense that what people want to do with this card is to blitz a creature out and then return it to hand before it would be sacrificed, allowing us to play it again next turn. That sounds nice, but the reality of that situation means that we are paying more mana than the creature's actual casting cost to put it back into our hand. It is an interesting trick, but the math doesn't really add up. It's the same reason that I won't be adding Sundial of the Infinite to this deck list either. You could pay a mana to stop the blitzed creature from dying, but at that point, why not just pay the regular cost for the creature, right? You're basically paying the same amount of mana anyway. Effectively, these cards would be fancy tricks for a deck that actually doesn't need all of that extra flourish. We can just play creatures and beat face. We don't need to try to be extravagant about it. And to be clear, Sabertooth is a really good card. I'm just not in love with it for this specific deck. Speaking of all these big creatures, let's pump things up a bit. I'm not a huge fan of the Artisan of Kozilek, just because it's so much mana to try and make this work. I'm a Reanimator player, believe me, I love getting stuff back out of the graveyard, but this one is a tougher sell. I'm definitely in the mood for some Eldritch Monstrosities though, and that's why I'm kinda eager to try Elder Brain in this deck instead. Like, oh my, what a lovely hand of cards you have there. Would be a shame if someone stole it from you. Henzie wants to make sure that we keep up on card advantage, and this card right here destabilizes someone else's plan while giving us tons of new toys to play with. And remember, Henzie can still blitz big creatures even if they're not being cast from our hand. We can actually blitz these cards out of exile. And here's what really sold me on Elder Brain. This is an attack trigger, not a damage trigger. All we have to do is attack with it once, and we've just secured ourselves a bunch of bonus cards. It's literally a big brain play. It is the worst joke I've ever written, but I don't care. We're keeping it. I'll also take this moment to exchange that Windgrace's Judgment for a creature version of the effect instead. I've seen Vevictus as Madi the Dyer do tons of work in EDH. It will be so fun to blitz this card out for a one-time removal effect, or it'll be super fun to hardcast it and then for it to stick around many turns in a row, tossing unnecessary mana dorks or mana rocks away to potentially cheat huge 7-drops into play, while simultaneously transforming enemy commanders or huge threats into lands instead. It's very hard for opponents to keep big threats on the battlefield when we have a Vevictus repeatedly chaos warping their best stuff. For this deck, I really like having our funky removal effects on creatures instead of on instants and sorceries, so Vevictus just delights me here. Which reminds me, speaking of flipping huge creatures into play for free, I have rarely seen a deck that wants a Lurking Predators quite as badly as this one. This green enchantment is busted in half. Play it if you can. Like, would I rather pay $7 for that Myth Unbound or $5 for a Lurking Predators? I'm gonna go with the one that could let us cheat multiple 8-drops into play for free. This card's incredible. And finally, I'm going to make one last swap. I think Phyrexian Reclamation is a perfectly fine card, and it certainly fits this strategy well enough, getting our creatures back to hand so that we can blitz them out all over again. I don't think it's my absolute favorite though, so I would like to swap it out for a card that feels tailor-made for this strategy. Have y'all met Kolfanor's Urn? Whenever a sufficiently large creature dies, Kolfanor's Urn keeps it secret, keeps it safe. Then, if enough creatures get hidden in the urn at the end of anyone's turn, those creatures all come sprawling back into play for free. This card is Wrath Protection. This is Blitz Collection. This is the perfect surprise for Henzie's Toolbox. Alright, those are the final swaps, but I'll round things out with some quick honorable mentions. If you're playing this deck on a tighter budget, then I've got good news for you. You can avoid these 3 creatures right here and lop like $28 off the price of the deck. And you can avoid these 3 lands to cut out another $47. A lot of the cost of this deck is contained just in the mana base, so play the mana support that makes the most sense to you, and that will take you very far. This strategy is really budget friendly. It's backbreaking for our enemies, not for our wallet. And how about the inverse? Well, there's plenty of room for spicier creatures if you want to soup things up. From Balefires to Worm Coils, really any large creature is going to thrive in Henzie's deck. Personally, I'm especially interested in Goreclaw, since she would help us cast all of these huge creatures a lot more easily. Then there are some expensive tricks to try too. Mikaeus is $20, but he's incredible to help get all of these creatures back again. Using Birthing Pod on a creature that was going to die anyway feels downright amazing. And don't hesitate to look into more Reanimator effects either. A lot of our stuff goes to the graveyard, and it's really gnarly to just pull them right back out for super cheap. And lastly, if you're in the mood for an especially interesting brewing experience, I really recommend giving Heartless Summoning a look. This isn't a terribly expensive card, but it does demand a slight shift in the deck's overall construction. This is a huge cost reduction for our spells, and if I were to build a Henzie deck for myself, this is absolutely a card that I would add and build around. Just note that it will affect some other cards that appear in this average list, so you do have to make a few hard decisions for the rest of the 99. In my opinion though, it's super worth it. If you're daring enough to give it a shot, this 2-mana tempo swing is so wacky and wonderful, and opponents will be too surprised to possibly keep up with it. Alright, that's it from me. Here we have Henzie's final deck. You can find a link to this deck list in the description below, with all the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you had a frenzy with Henzie, and if you have any other recommendations for gadgets that you think your fellow Toolbox players ought to put into their decks too, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.